There's a key rule in the art of illusion. If you want to hide something large, you don't try to cover it up. Instead, you give the audience something louder and flashier to focus on. As long as you keep their attention on the fireworks and sudden movements, they'll never notice what you've quietly snuck right into the middle of the room. For a long time, the modern religious machine has been putting on a spectacular, deafening show. But what happens when you finally look away from the fireworks? What occurs when you let your eyes adjust and see what's actually sitting in the center of the sanctuary? Welcome back to The Faithful Citizen. I'm Ellison Keller. This is part 2 of our Comfortable Theology series. Today, the jig is up. We're going to move beyond the smoke and mirrors and finally discuss the dragon in the room. Let's get into it.
Yeah. Welcome to the space where conviction meets rhythm, where truth got a mic and the church gotta listen. This ain't Sunday talk, it's real life living. Faith in motion, the citizen's mission. We talk grace, we talk justice, we talk peace. Not the kind that conforms, but the kind that frees the world's loud with noise. We cut through division, this is the faithful citizen. Let's get to the wisdom.
In the first part of this series, we named the phantoms. We watched the religious machine exhaust itself shadowboxing with wokeness and cultural Marxism, manufacturing a perpetual state of emergency to keep the pews terrified and compliant. But what happens when you finally step off the empire's fabricated battlefield? What happens when you stop swinging at ghosts and let your eyes adjust to the reality of the room? When the stage lights dim and the fog machines clear, you finally see it. Wrapped tightly around the altar, occupying the space where the communion table used to be, is a massive gold-hoarding dragon. In J.R.R. Tolkien's The Hobbit, the defining trait of the great dragon Smaug isn't just his destructive fire, but his paralyzing dragon sickness, an obsessive parasitic greed. Smaug produces nothing of value. Instead, he violently claims the labor of others, hoards vast wealth in the lonely mountain, and sleeps comfortably on a bed of gold while the marginalized people of Laketown live in his terrifying, impoverished shadow. The American church has effortlessly merged the gospel of the foot-washing Christ with the harsh realities of late-stage capitalism. We must honestly acknowledge this reality. The modern religious system hasn't just tolerated the dragon of greed, it spiritually endorsed it. It has welcomed a modern Smaug directly into its sacred space. The disparity is glaring. The loudest voices in the American church carry an intense, breathless outrage over gender identity and sexual orientation. The gatekeepers will tear a community apart, fiercely policing the boundaries of belonging. They'll launch multi-million-dollar campaigns and completely excommunicate members to uphold their rigid cultural lines. Yet, when it comes to the most frequently condemned sin in the entire biblical text, economic exploitation, hoarding vast wealth, and systematically crushing the poor, there's an absolute deafening silence. The silence from the pulpit about this economic violence isn't accidental or due to misplaced priorities. It's a structural necessity. The institution simply can't condemn the dragon because it's entirely funded by it. Speaking the truth about wealth hoarding would mean biting the hand that funds the fortress. Therefore, the machine keeps shouting at ghosts to stop anyone from noticing the gold. So, what are we to do? Take a moment to reflect on the deeply rooted mechanics of modern church discipline. When a member of the congregation, such as a committed youth leader, a worship band volunteer, or a recently divorced mother, strays from the church's strict cultural and sexual standards, the reaction is almost always swift, firm, and precisely targeted. Boundaries are quickly established. Emergency meetings are convened. The language of protecting the flock is used to describe the individual's systematic removal from their community, spiritual home, and dignity. The gatekeepers of the sanctuary act with the rapid and unwavering accuracy of an immune system, targeting a perceived virus. But what happens when a prominent local developer whose business model relies on aggressive gentrification, predatory lending, and the mass eviction of low-income families walks through the heavy doors. What happens when the CEO of a regional corporation, who recently approved the termination of 300 pensions to boost quarterly shareholder dividends, decides to make this megachurch his new spiritual home? There are no emergency measures to curb his greed. There's no pastoral challenge addressing the destruction his wealth harvesting has inflicted on the city's working class. Instead, he receives a warm, deferential handshake from the lead pastor, is welcomed into the VIP green room, and within a year is invariably nominated to the elder board. The modern church doesn't discipline the dragon. It offers him a steering committee. This staggering hypocrisy isn't a flaw in the American religious system. It's its defining feature. To accommodate the dragon, the gatekeepers had to carry out a grand, centuries-long theological sleight of hand. They had to fundamentally change the meaning of sin. Over the past century, the comfortable theology of the empire has effectively confined the concept of sin almost entirely to personal, private, and predominantly sexual behaviors. By reducing the moral universe to the size of a bedroom, the institution conveniently ignored the realities of the boardroom. If sin is defined solely by what you watch online, what you drink, or who you love, then the vast, relentless machinery of systemic economic violence is suddenly outside moral scrutiny. The biblical prophets are effectively silenced. Amos denounced those who trample the head of the poor into the dust of the earth. Isaiah issued harsh warnings against those who join house to house, who add field to field until there is no more room. Yet, these strong structural condemnations of land grabbing, wage theft, and economic monopolization are completely removed from the empire's teachings. In this sanitized, highly individualistic moral framework, someone can be a ruthless corporate raider from Monday to Friday, ruining the lives of hundreds, and still be praised as a man of God on Sunday because they don't swear and listen to the right Christian podcasts. Tolkien deeply understood the environmental and communal effects of unchecked hoarding greed. In The Hobbit, the land around the Lonely Mountain is called the Desolation of Smaug. It's a scorched, empty wasteland, stripped of life, joy, and vitality, all so one creature can rest peacefully on a mountain of hoarded treasure. The dragon's comfort demands the complete destruction of the surrounding ecosystem. The modern billionaire and the ruthless corporate machinery they steer operate on the same principle. Accumulating immense dragon-like wealth is seldom the result of simple hard work. It's a process of colossal extraction. It demands destruction. It involves suppressed wages, dismantled unions, gig economy exploitation, stripped healthcare benefits, and the continual commodification of human labor. It leaves behind a trail of exhausted, underpaid workers struggling to afford basic groceries while the wealth at the top grows exponentially. Yet, when this desolation enters the sanctuary, the church doesn't mourn for the scorched earth. It doesn't call for justice or restitution for the struggling people of Laketown. Instead, it lays a baptismal hand on the dragon's head and rebrands its hoarding. The ruthless extraction is renamed as divine favor. The hoarding is lauded as biblical stewardship. The vast concentrated wealth, which Jesus explicitly warned was a deadly spiritual poison, is celebrated as irrefutable evidence of God's blessing. By inviting the architect of the desolation onto the elder board, the church clearly ties its survival to the dragon's hoard. The institution surveys the scorched earth, recognizes the financial resources it can gather for its own building funds and expansion projects, and considers the desolation just the cost of doing business. The tragedy is complete. The sanctuary, meant to be a refuge for the vulnerable, has been turned into a tax-deductible fortress for the very creature that's actively burning their homes to the ground. If you took a highlighter to a Bible and marked every passage addressing the eradication of poverty, the condemnation of hoarded wealth, and the call for economic justice, the book would practically glow in the dark. The sheer volume of these prophetic writings is overwhelming. When you read the ancient Hebrew prophets, Amos, Micah, Isaiah, Jeremiah, you don't find a group of men worrying over vague cultural changes or policing the boundaries of personal morality. Instead, you find a group of radical street preachers delivering harsh, holy fire on the ruling class for manipulating the economic system. Amos doesn't condemn the people of Israel because their worship music is too secular or their prayers too brief. He condemns them because they sell the righteous for silver and the needy for a pair of sandals. He calls out the wealthy who lounge on beds of ivory while the surrounding communities starve. Isaiah pronounces doom on the monopolizers of real estate, the ancient corporate landlords who join house to house, who add field to field until there is no more room, and you are made to dwell alone in the midst of the land. This is the undeniable heartbeat of the prophetic tradition. God's ledger isn't balanced by a nation's loud declaration of piety, but by its treatment of the most economically vulnerable citizens. However, in the modern sanctuary, this powerful prophetic witness has been drowned out by the dragon's smoke. This prophetic trajectory doesn't weaken when we reach the New Testament. It intensifies. When Jesus of Nazareth enters the scene, he identifies the dragon by name. In the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus delivers a devastating, non-negotiable ultimatum. No one can serve two masters. You cannot serve God and wealth. But the Aramaic word Jesus uses for wealth here is mammon. He doesn't just describe money as a neutral medium of exchange or a passive tool. He personifies it. Jesus describes mammon as a sentient, rival deity. It's an active, predatory force that competes for your absolute allegiance. Mammon demands your worship, your time, your energy, and ultimately, your soul. This is the theological equivalent of Tolkien's dragon sickness. When the dwarves in The Hobbit reclaim the Lonely Mountain, Thorin Oakenshield is entirely consumed by the horde. The gold becomes his god. He's willing to go to war, betray his friends, and let the people of Lake Town starve and burn, all to ensure that not a single coin is taken from his pile. Dragon sickness is the worship of Mammon. It's the terrifying, blinding delusion that your hoarded wealth is your salvation, security, and identity. Jesus understood that Mammon is the only false god powerful enough to successfully masquerade as the true God. The tragedy of the American church is that it has looked at Mammon, looked at the dragon coiled around the altar, and declared it to be the Holy Spirit. But the dragon isn't simply a brute creature of fire and claws. If you recall Bilbo Baggins' encounter in the mountain's heart, Smaug's most dangerous weapon isn't his breath, it's his voice. Smaug is a master of sophistry. He's charming, intelligent, deeply manipulative, and highly skilled at twisting the truth to protect his gold. The institution that contains the modern interpretation of the Bible has had to master this same linguistic trickery. Because the biblical text is so openly opposed to the accumulation of wealth, the gatekeepers have had to come up with remarkably creative ways to soften the gospel. There's no better example of this trickery than how the modern church interprets Jesus' most well-known economic statement. It is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich person to enter the kingdom of God. If you've spent any time in an evangelical church, you've probably heard a pastor explain this verse with a convenient historical fact. They'll tell you earnestly that the eye of the needle was actually the name of a very small, low gate in the wall of ancient Jerusalem. According to this popular sermon illustration, a merchant arriving after dark could only get his camel through this tiny gate if he unloaded all its baggage and forced the beast to kneel to squeeze through. The theological conclusion? Jesus wasn't actually condemning wealth or calling for the redistribution of possessions. He was simply emphasizing that wealthy individuals need to remain humble. They just need to kneel, acknowledge God, and then carry their burdens beyond the gate. It's a warm, reassuring, perfectly suited message for a congregation of affluent suburbanites. There's only one issue. It's a complete and utter fabrication. There's never been a gate in Jerusalem called the Eye of the Needle. No historical, archaeological, or textual evidence for such a gate exists before the Middle Ages. It's a myth. It's a fairy tale created by religious commentators who were too afraid of the text's actual demands. Jesus wasn't offering a gentle, manageable metaphor about humility. He was using a brilliant, absurd, comedic hyperbole to make a devastating point. A massive, literal camel can't fit through the microscopic eye of a literal sewing needle. It's impossible. Jesus is saying that the kingdom of God, the realm of radical mercy and justice, is fundamentally incompatible with the hoarding of wealth. You can't drag the dragon's hoard into the kingdom of heaven. But the empire can't openly admit that, so they invent a magical gate. They use the dragon's sophistry to neutralize the prophetic ledger. They pad the needle, shrink the camel, and assure the rich young rulers in the congregation that they can keep every single gold coin as long as they feel properly humble about it. To understand why the American church has so thoroughly sanitized Jesus' teachings on wealth, we must look beyond theology and examine the financials. The profound, deafening silence from the pulpit on the sins of corporate greed and economic exploitation isn't simply a matter of pastoral oversight. It's a strict, unyielding institutional necessity. The modern religious empire, with its multi-million-dollar campuses, its concert-grade production values, its sprawling administrative staff, and its relentless expansion campaigns, requires an immense, uninterrupted flow of capital to survive. You can't build a fortress of that size on the modest tithes of teachers, social workers, and baristas. To keep the lights on, the smoke machines running, and the mortgage paid, the institution must secure funding from the donor class. The church needs the dragons. And the absolute golden rule of the modern religious machine is this: you don't, under any circumstances, bite the hand that funds the fortress. If a pastor were to stand in the pulpit and genuinely preach the unfiltered economic demands of the Gospels, if they were to call for the redistribution of hoarded wealth, condemn the exploitation of the working class, and call out the systemic greed of the executive sitting in the front row, the financial lifeblood of the institution would be cut off overnight. The major donors would quietly withdraw their pledges, the building fund would collapse, and the lonely mountain would fall. The silence on greed is the price of admission for institutional survival. To justify this unholy alliance, the church has crafted a highly refined, respectable version of the prosperity gospel. This isn't the flashy, late-night televangelist prosperity gospel of private jets and miracle spring water. Instead, it's the quiet, suburban prosperity gospel. It's subtle, widespread, and deeply insidious. The respectable prosperity gospel rests on a simple, unspoken equation. Financial success clearly reflects divine favor, while poverty subtly indicates a spiritual shortfall. In this theological view, the billionaire on the elder board isn't regarded as a ruthless money collector. He's seen as someone whom God has especially blessed due to his faithfulness and hard work. Conversely, the single mother struggling to pay rent is implicitly seen as someone who just needs to pray more, better manage her finances, or trust God more. This theology essentially baptizes the dragon. It looks at a creature afflicted with advanced terminal dragon sickness and assures him that his overwhelming greed is actually righteousness. It turns hoarding wealth from a serious spiritual warning into the highest Christian goal. But the most tragic aspect of this comfortable theology is the collateral damage it causes. In The Hobbit, Smaug's luxurious sleep inside the lonely mountain comes at a terrible cost to the people living in his shadow. The citizens of Laketown live in a constant state of instability, shivering in the cold with their economy stunted and their lives perpetually threatened by the beast's presence. The dragon's comfort requires their deprivation. This exact pattern occurs every week in the pews of the American church. While the pastor is in the VIP room blessing the good business decisions of the corporate executive, the downstream effects of those decisions are crushing the working-class members of the congregation. The elder board member's decision to maximize shareholder value by cutting health benefits directly impacts the warehouse worker sitting 3 rows behind him. The real estate developer's choice to aggressively gentrify a neighborhood directly leads to the eviction of the fixed-income widow who volunteers in the church nursery. The institution compels the people of Laketown to worship alongside the very dragon that's destroying their lives, and then has the nerve to call it community. The church tells exploited workers to seek comfort in the afterlife, while ensuring that exploiters enjoy their heaven right now, built on the backs of the vulnerable. The tragedy of the modern pulpit isn't just that it protects the lonely mountain. It's that it demands the people of Laketown pay for the privilege of being scorched. The economic system that the American church has eagerly embraced is better described as the economy of Rome. It's a worldview founded entirely on artificial scarcity and endless extraction. It demands constant growth, the commodification of the natural world, and the ongoing depletion of human labor. In the economy of Rome, your worth is closely tied to your productivity, and your security depends solely on your ability to accumulate and safeguard capital. This is more than a financial strategy. It reflects the structural and societal effects of dragon sickness. In Tolkien's Legendarium, the gold of the Lonely Mountain is cursed not by magic, but by the sheer gravitational pull of the greed it sparks. Dragon sickness doesn't merely make a person wealthy, it makes them paranoid, isolated, and fundamentally inhuman. It's a corrosive obsession that convinces the hoarder they're under constant threat, justifying any violence or exploitation needed to protect the pile. The American capitalist gospel views this terminal spiritual illness and calls it the American dream. By integrating this system into the sanctuary, the modern religious machine teaches its congregants to desire sickness. It frames the relentless pursuit of the hoard as a righteous endeavor, a sign that they're properly using their God-given talents. It tells the congregation that if they hustle hard enough, perhaps they too can one day climb to the top of the lonely mountain and rest on a bed of gold. However, the God of the biblical text is essentially opposed to the dragon. When God intervenes to free the Hebrew people from the Pharaoh's rule, we need to understand what Pharaoh symbolized. Egypt was the ancient world's ultimate example of the dragon's economy. It was a vast, centralized superpower built entirely on the brutal exploitation of slave labor and the obsessive hoarding of grain in massive storehouses. When God leads the people out of Egypt, He doesn't just give them new songs to sing on the weekend. He pulls them into the wilderness to violently deconstruct their economic mindset. He has to rid them of the dragon sickness in their blood. To do this, He introduces them to the economy of manna. The wilderness serves as a testing ground for economic renewal, with the fundamental lesson being manna. The principles of this new economy are beautifully simple, yet deeply challenge the core of the dragon's logic. God supplies bread from heaven daily, but with a strict, sacred rule. Gather only what you need for today. Don't take more. Don't store it for tomorrow. The economy of manna rests on the bold, daunting idea of daily sufficiency. It completely eliminates artificial scarcity. In the wilderness, there's exactly enough for everyone, but only if no one takes more than their fair share. It's a system that physically compels the community into mutual dependence and total reliance on the ongoing divine supply, rather than on the static, lifeless security of a personal hoard. Of course, the Israelites carry the trauma of Egypt with them into the desert. Their internalized dragon sickness flares up. They look at the manna and, driven by the sheer terror of scarcity, they attempt to operate this new economy using Pharaoh's playbook. They try to hoard it. They try to build tiny, individual mountains of bread, hiding it in their tents to ensure they have leverage for tomorrow, just in case God's supply chain falters. But the biblical text specifically describes what happens to the hoarded manna. It immediately attracts worms and decays. It physically produces a foul smell in the camp. This is no coincidence. It's a deep theological message. God embeds an anti-hoarding mechanism directly into the very fabric of their daily bread. The rot of the manna serves as a divine sensory judgment on hoarding excess wealth. It acts as a physical reminder that trying to secure your own future by hoarding resources meant for the wider community is a spiritual illness that leads only to decay. While the dragon's gold may shine forever, creating an illusion of eternal security, the economy of heaven requires daily trust. It emphasizes that hoarded wealth isn't a blessing to cherish, but a rotting, worm-infested burden that will ultimately destroy the soul of those who cling to it. When we seek the Jesus who confronts the dragon, we don't find a mild-mannered philosopher offering polite, abstract critiques of the Roman economy. Instead, we find a revolutionary who walked into the heart of his era's religious and economic powers, sat down, and braided a whip of cords. The cleansing of the temple is perhaps the most misunderstood and sanitized event in the modern lectionary. Jesus wasn't throwing a tantrum because people were selling souvenirs in the lobby. He was carrying out a deliberate prophetic act against a religious elite that had turned the sanctuary into a predatory extraction operation. The money changers and the sellers of doves were controlling a monopoly that exploited the poorest worshippers, forcing them to exchange their Roman coins at outrageous rates just to take part in community life. The temple had become the lonely mountain. When Jesus overturned the tables, scattering the hoarded coins across the stone floor and driving the livestock out of the courts, his physical, righteous anger was directed solely at this systemic economic violence. He looked at the gatekeepers who were profiting off the backs of the vulnerable and quoted the prophet Jeremiah, declaring they had turned a house of prayer into a den of robbers. This wasn't just a theological correction, it was a structural attack. It was the gospel's equivalent of firing the black arrow directly into the dragon's one vulnerable, unarmored spot. Jesus struck the beast precisely where it hurt, its ledger. For those of you listening to this, the exiles, the deconstructing, the ones who've been pushed out of the sanctuary for asking too many questions, you need to hear this clearly. You've been told that leaving the institution is a sign of spiritual failure. You've been warned that stepping away from the megachurch means walking away from God. But if the institution you're attending is actively harboring a dragon, walking away isn't a loss of faith. It's an act of profound, holy rebellion. You can't heal from the trauma of the empire while you're simultaneously tithing to its machinery. You can't find spiritual peace while you're financially supporting the very fog machines that obscure the beast. The most powerful prophetic action you can take right now is to stop feeding the dragon. Refuse to applaud a theology that blesses the hoarding of wealth while ignoring the starving of the vulnerable. Refuse to write another check to a fortress that views your working-class neighbors as collateral damage. Your resources are your black arrow. Stop firing them into the dragon's hoard and start using them to tear the mountain down. This brings us back to the wilderness. When you leave the empire, you don't step into an empty space. You step into the real world. You enter the realm where the economy of manna can truly be practiced. Our calling is to rebuild a radically different kind of table. We're called to reconstruct our faith not on the mechanics of corporate growth, perpetual accumulation, or the false, terrifying scarcity of the economy of Rome, but on the ancient, subversive foundation of radical mercy and restorative justice. This is quiet, deeply ordinary, and revolutionary work. It looks like taking the money you used to drop in the offering plate for the new sanctuary lighting system and using it to pay off a neighbor's medical debt. It looks like fighting for fair wages in your local community, organizing mutual aid, and fiercely protecting the vulnerable people the empire has discarded. It requires rejecting the isolating, paranoid nature of dragon sickness and fully embracing the wilderness's shared, messy interdependence. The religious machine will inevitably keep shouting at ghosts. It'll continue to create cultural panics and wage imaginary wars against vague phantoms to keep the congregations terrified, the offering plates overflowing, and the dragon fed. Let them fight their illusions. Let them guard their decaying manna. Our mission is entirely different. We're called to the margins. We're called to confront the dragon, dismantle the theology of comfort, and build a table so outrageously and recklessly generous that the empire can't even comprehend it. Welcome to the wilderness. Keep sharing the manna and keep your tables fiercely open. Thank you for spending this time with us on The Faithful Citizen. If this episode inspired you to stop feeding the dragon and walk away from the hoard entirely, the best way to help us grow is to hit that subscribe button, like the episode, and leave us a rating. It may seem small, but in a digital age driven by the economics of outrage and artificial scarcity, those actions go a long way toward helping this message reach the exiles in the wilderness who need to hear it most. We want to continue this conversation. Visit the Substack to read the full transcript of Part 2 of our Comfortable Theology series. Join the discussion in the comments, and share your own thoughts on what it means to keep building tables in the wilderness. Finally, for those who've asked how to support our work, I've included a link in the show notes to our voluntary paid subscription tier. I want to be very clear. We're deeply committed to keeping all of our essays and podcasts freely accessible to everyone. We want to make sure our resources go towards helping people rather than feeding the dragon or building our own lonely mountain. Your support simply helps us maintain the research and production that goes into every episode. Until next time, may we reject the paranoid isolation of dragon sickness and instead gather the manna to share our bread with those the gatekeepers have cast aside.